welcome to The Link Online. And welcome to another edition of The Link, where we talk about news and views from Canada, innovations in science, what's happening in sports, and Canadian views on world affairs. And I'd like to say hello to listeners on World Radio Paris, also on the shortwave service from Germany, and our friends in Nigeria, Kauri 97.5. And we're here in studio once again, along with Terry Haig. No, you can say something. That's a microphone.
I was just trying to figure out what show you were describing there.
No, this is The Link.
Intro, eh?
The Link.
The Link, okay.
The Link Online. Yeah, you've been here before,
show
right?
We do, okay. All right. What? Okay. Good, Montgomery. Fantasyland. It's Disney, ladies and gentlemen. Okay.
And Levon Simmons.
I'm here.
Okay, thank God.
And in the control room, always wondering what we're doing, are Pierre-Luc Blais, Benoît Durand, and El Capitaine, Pierre Dutil.
Can you say his name? Say it loud.
He likes that.
Say it loud. Scream it out.
Indeed. Well, we've got, as always, a wide variety of items on the show today. Terry, what do you have for us?
I got a story about a documentary film that's coming out tonight, in fact, about a tour of the Montreal Symphony Orchestra through Quebec's Great North. It sounds fabulous.
Okay. Levon?
And I'll be speaking about the UN Food Assistance Agency warning about the escalating crisis in Burkina Faso and the neighboring countries of the Sahel region of West Africa.
And on the international scale as well, I talk about a Canadian who has been a longtime proponent of closer ties with China, who has changed her tune, and she thinks we should get tough now. That's coming up on this edition of The Link Online. All right, we're going to start out with a story about Canada-China relations, and it has been a year since Canadians Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor have been in Chinese custody in what is widely viewed as a case of political retribution for Canada's detention of Huawei executive Meng Wanzhou. In what is seen as increasing the pressure on Canada, China has now hinted it may begin prosecution of the men, along with the much lesser-known cases of two other Canadians charged with drug offenses and whose charges have now been increased with potential death sentences. Now, Margaret McQuaig Johnston has over 3 decades of national and international experience in government, working to promote closer ties with China, particularly in business and science and technology. She is currently a senior fellow with the China Institute at the University of Alberta and a senior fellow at the Institute of Science, Society and Policy at the University of Ottawa. Now, in light of the Chinese actions in recent years, in this excerpt, I asked her if she had changed her position of one promoting a positive view of China.
Yes, I have. I was in Shanghai when Michael Kovrig was detained. And I was there to speak at an international conference, and I mentioned his detention to a Chinese national who I was meeting with later that day. And he said, well, you know, there's a list of 100 Canadians that China has that they can pick up and interrogate at any time. And when I got back from that meeting, I found that my locked suitcases had been searched. And then the next day, Michael Spavor was detained. And so I decided when I returned from China that I would start to speak out against these detentions. And I think it sends a particularly strong message to Beijing that even someone like me thinks that their behavior is abhorrent. To kidnap citizens of other countries to use as leverage in whatever dispute China has with the other country. And we're certainly not the first. Australia and South Korea and Japan and Sweden and other countries have been facing this kind of action on China's part as well. So yes, I too have been saying we should take stronger action, particularly if Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor are charged. So at the point that they're charged, I think we should be working with other countries to take strong action against China so that it starts to see some consequences to its behavior.
Again, there have been lots of accusations about China stealing technology and so on. I'm just wondering, should we be rethinking everything we do with China and look elsewhere?
Well, one of the things I've recommended is that we develop a new Indo-Pacific strategy where we would deepen our relations with other countries in the region. And reflected in that strategy would be a new approach to China, recognizing that it's under Xi Jinping, it's become a much more aggressive nation internationally. And we'll need to continue to work with it in some areas, but I think we should insulate ourselves in others. So when you talk about intellectual property being stolen, I'm documenting dozens of cases where this has happened. So yes, I think we do need to take a tougher look at our economic policy towards China. And, what I'm suggesting represents fairly serious actions towards another country, but we're in a serious situation.
I'm just wondering, Ms. McQuaig-Johnston, are Canadians naive when it comes to China? Or is the Western world a bit naive at times when it comes to China?
Well, in business discussions, Chinese business people often say to Canadians that we're Han, which is a first tone of that word, H-A-N, which means open and straightforward and flexible. And behind our backs, they laugh among themselves that we're the other meaning of that word, which is naive and gullible. And we have to start looking at China with more clear glasses rather than rose-colored glasses. And we need to start looking very carefully at where we have points of engagement with them to see, are these really essential, or should we be backing out of some of those in order to protect our own economy and our own citizens.
And that was a portion of my conversation with Margaret McQuaig-Johnston, and she has over 3 decades of national and international experience in government and is currently a senior fellow with the China Institute at the University of Alberta and senior fellow at the Institute of Science, Society and Policy at the University of Ottawa. So there's another person who has said, that the Liberal government currently should be taking a harder stance on several issues in relation to China regarding this whole situation of the deterioration of diplomatic and trade ties and so on.
It's interesting. Yesterday, Foreign Affairs Minister François-Félix Champagne was asked about it, and he says it's his number one absolute priority, getting the two Michaels released and working on resolving this issue. But I guess we have to understand that Canada is caught in the middle, between the rock and the hard place. It's until the U.S. and China resolve their differences, I frankly don't see how Canada can come out of this. It's a pretty depressing situation, considering the difference in weight categories when you're taking on a giant like China that has no trouble, basically arresting people. As she said, they have a list of 100 people. I'd be curious to know whether Canadian security agencies have a similar list that they can think about in terms of retaliation. But, we're going into a territory that a lot of Canadian politicians wouldn't even consider discussing. They would say, we don't engage in hostage diplomacy. But I think what it was very revealing because I remember her championing just as, just a few years ago when the Liberals got to power, she was talking about, closer relationship with China. We were talking about a free trade deal with China, and see where we are now.
Well, one of the things she said in an interview, the longer interview, which you can find on the website, is that she said, look, if somebody like me is coming out against China, then imagine what that means. Because, as you say, she was a long-time proponent, say we should have closer ties, we've got to be nice with these people, we'll get along, and so on and so forth. And now she's saying, look, it's just not working. This is a different situation, a different country than it was 20 years ago, sort of thing.
Don't we have big negotiations coming up this weekend between Washington and Beijing? How will that play out, Levon, as far as Canada goes?
Well, Trump was tweeting that they're very, very close to a deal. So we'll see how it plays out. I mean,
A Trump tweet can mean anything, though.
yes, exactly. So I mean, we'll see. It's really important for China and U.S. to get their differences, work it out, because this whole thing, don't forget, this whole thing started because the U.S. sent a request, an arrest warrant for this Chinese executive Meng Wanzhou, who is the chief financial officer of Huawei Technologies. And if Canada hadn't arrested her, we'd still be probably talking about some closer cooperation with China.
And those guys wouldn't be in jail, eh?
Yes.
But we had to, because
we have this
because
treaty.
we have the extradition treaty with one of our biggest trading partners.
We didn't have to. I mean, there are a lot of people saying we could have quietly let her go, feign ignorance, or do other things just to. But it's true. I mean, I don't think the Liberal government was counting on this kind of a reaction from China, which is kind of surprising, knowing how China has dealt with similar issues in the past. I mean, she said a lot of our allies, the Germans, the Swedes, have had the Australians have had the same experience. So we'll see.
And as always, of course, if you want more information on this story, you can go to our website and check out this story and all the others on the show today, and a lot more of other interesting stories as well. And you can download the app as well. There's a free app there. If you want to get that downloaded on the website, you can see the spot there. Coming up, we're going to be looking at another international story, this one involving Burkina Faso. All right, international humanitarian aid agencies are sounding the alarm about a deteriorating situation in this section of the world, in Burkina Faso in particular, and you looked at that story, Levon.
Well, Mark, you remember back in early November, a lot of people in Canada were shocked by this brazen attack on a mining convoy in Burkina Faso. It killed 38 people, injured 60 others. They were traveling to work in a Canadian, gold mine in the eastern part of Burkina Faso. But this attack, as brazen, as bloody as it was just the latest in a string of attacks and unrest that has plagued Burkina Faso and the central Sahel region of West Africa in the last few years. The World Food Program, which is the UN's food assistance agency, says the international community must really ramp up its humanitarian response to protect and save lives in Burkina Faso and in neighboring Mali and Niger. The UN estimates that nearly 486,000 people have been forced to flee their homes in Burkina Faso alone because of this ongoing violence in the north and the eastern parts of the country. This exodus has brought the total number of internally displaced people in the Sahel region to close to 1 million. So 860,000 people who've been internally displaced across Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger because of this ongoing crisis. And on top of this is the region that is on the front lines of dealing with the fallout from climate change. For more on this, I spoke with Canadian humanitarian worker Marwa Awad. She is the spokesperson for the World Food Program, and she traveled to Burkina Faso in November.
In Burkina Faso, where I visited last month, a third of the country is actually under armed conflict now, which is pretty significant. And just seeing that dramatic rise in insecurity as well as high rates of displacement, we're quite worried that people will not be able to survive much longer unless more and more assistance is given. I went to an area called Kaya, which is about an hour and a half north of Ouagadougou, the capital. And there were a series of camps as well as host communities, and we met with a lot of families, and they recounted the horror that they've seen. One family, for instance, told us the father and his wife and children were in a marketplace, and suddenly there was shooting, and the father ended up losing one of his siblings, one of his brothers, and he had to literally hide by running away from the market along with his wife and children. And because the men are the ones who tend to be targeted, he had to hide in the riverbed for a few days, he told us, until the community felt safe again, that the militant groups were no longer there. And then he was able to come out and then grab his family and get out of the village where they were living. So it's quite traumatizing, and we could see that trauma in the eyes of the children and the women, and of course the elderly people, everyone who was feeling vulnerable by all of this. And many of them told us that they want to go back. Nobody really wants to live a life of a displaced person and constantly be feeling to be, at the mercy of neighbors and the NGOs and the organizations. So people want to go back to a normal life, and we are trying to provide this to them, just giving them that respite, that assistance that they need to keep going. But it's certainly not a situation that they want to become permanent.
That was an excerpt of my interview with Marwa Awad. She's a Canadian humanitarian worker and the spokesperson for the World Food Programme. She was in Burkina Faso in November for WFP and graciously provided us those images of her trip. I reached her at the WFP headquarters in Rome upon her return. Spoke to her on Wednesday.
When you see a situation like that, I mean, you have the violence on top of the climate situation, where it's already tough to get enough food because the crops are failing because of drought or sudden floods or whatever, and then you have on top of that people coming in and stealing your food and killing you and so on and so forth. It's just incredible that these things go on.
It's really shocking because we don't hear much about the situation in West Africa. When the Canadian peacekeepers were in Mali, the Canadian media tended to speak about that a bit more, but it's like the Canadians have now left, and it's almost like out of sight, out of mind. And so I think it's very important to bring these stories back to the attention of the Canadian public, of the international public, because really the situation in the Sahel region is probably one of the most dramatic humanitarian situations the international community is facing right now.
Well, when you have hundreds of thousands of displaced people, like you say, almost a million, and I don't see that situation improving. Again, when you have that area of the world suffering from climate change, people have to say, well, the crops are failing here, I have to go somewhere else. So people are always moving, and they're moving into places where there are already people, and people say, well, we don't want you coming in here because it's a problem for us. So,
And on top of that, you have these jihadist groups like the Islamic State, like offshoots of Al-Qaeda, that have been very good at using the unrest, the instability, the weakness of local governments, their inability to provide services to basically set up bases there. And you see this up until a few years ago, Burkina Faso was always politically more unstable. I don't think there is a single president that they've had in their history that changed power democratically. They were all results of coup d'etats. So you have this situation where there's already political instability, and then you have the situation in Mali and in Niger, this unrest where you have the Tuareg nationalists, an alliance with the jihadists, and then this thing flowing back and forth between the borders. So you have a regional instability now, and it seems to be growing despite the efforts by the United Nations, by the international community. This whole instability seems to be getting worse instead of getting better.
Because there is no real central power to sort of direct things and control things. It's as you say, it's several different groups all vying for power and whatever. So that's not going to be cleared up in the immediate future, I would expect. Anyway, we're going to move on to a bit of a better news story, and that one takes place in Canada's far north, in Quebec. Terry, this is your story, and it's about a film that is opening in Montreal tonight.
Big time, Sylvans. He's talking to me. You know? he's a
Hello.
superstar.
Terry.
It's tough to approach Montgomery on.
Phone him up, get his attention. Terry, this is your film.
Okay, this is
Montreal
I wish
tonight.
it were my film. It looks like it's going to be a beautiful film. It opens tonight. It's the result of this amazing guy that we have, a neighbor of ours named Kent Nagano, who is the maestro of the Montreal Symphony Orchestra. Okay, he's a totally great guy, and an all-star team of people in show business. Roger Frappier, who's a superstar producer. Anyway, they decide. Mr. Nagano, Maestro Nagano, put together a show based on Chakapesh, the trickster's quest. He's the story of a hero. He lives in a whale. He founded the Innu people. Okay, so they put together.
So this is an Innu folk legend you're talking about.
That's right.
Okay,
and so they put together this tour of the great north of Quebec. Okay. One of the stated aims is this. Check this out, guys. To share an indigenous chamber opera whose mission is to teach white men how to laugh and therefore to love more. That's a pretty darn good idea, right? Hey? Hey, guys? Hey? Funny, huh? Hey?
All right.
And loving.
Loving.
Okay, all right. Anyway, so one of the co-directors and one of the co-writers is an old acquaintance of mine named Justin Kingsley. Young man on the way up. Well, he's not so young anymore. And he helped put together the film. So I asked him about that mission statement that I just mentioned and how it came to be.
When I met Maestro Nagano the first time, I asked him, "Why are you doing this, sir?" And he said to me, "Justin, in Canada, cultural collaborations have always traditionally been east-west." And I thought to myself, why don't we do something north-south? And as soon as I heard those words, I understood the intention. And that's what this film is about. It's about the intention. Bringing all those people together is the best form of collaboration I've seen anywhere. So we've got all these leaders and politicians talking about reconciliation, but here we have a group of people led by a Japanese-American conductor whose parents were in internment camps, so he has an idea of that history, the sense of history, the importance of this, and he decides, I'm going to do something about it, I'm going to act. So we had to Roger and I had to make this film because it's our duty, it's our responsibility to share this story and to provide an example, to be leaders in, let's stop talking about this stuff and let's do. And so that was the intention for everybody in this project. And it's really, I know I co-directed it, but I think it's turning out pretty good.
I've always felt that the highest mankind ever gets is watching a symphony orchestra warm up before a show, this cacophony of different sounds.
Yeah.
And then they come together and they create an exquisite experience for all of us in the audience. Is that part of what made this film go? And how different, Justin, is the music from up there and the music that we were bringing, that you guys were bringing from down here?
Well, that's a great question. And it's when you get into the orchestra pit and you start learning how it works, how an orchestra works, it is fascinating. One example I like to give is oftentimes the person playing violin can't hear the person playing the trumpet on the other side of the stage.
Mm-hmm.
So, you start seeing, okay, there's 100 people on the stage and this is something special. And yeah, when they start playing together, when they start
it's amazing.
making music, it's it's a game changer. And it, for me and for most of us, it just transports us to another place. But what was magic about up there is they've never seen an orchestra before. The only time there's ever been an orchestra up north was, well, Kent Nagano 10 years ago, who took a small chamber orchestra and went up there. But that time he performed Mozart and Beethoven and Prokofiev and those guys. But this time he wanted to present something to them in their language, with local artists on stage with the orchestra, with Cree, Inuit performers on stage, white guys singing in Cree, and a narrator. So this whole experience, no one's ever done this. But the sad reality is that Kent Nagano's been up north more often than many of our premiers in this province. So they'd never seen an orchestra there. Their tradition in some of these Inuit villages was throat singing, right, which is thousands of years old. It predates classical music by a long time, right? Mm-hmm. Beethoven was about 250 years ago. Mm-hmm. So it was just really interesting. And in our film, you'll see it. You'll see that's why we went up there with the best camera and audio technology you can get. We shot a documentary, but we made a film, like a fiction film. We used Alexa cameras. We recorded with Dolby 5.1, which means when you look at the image, you have a sense of the time and the place where you are. And when you listen to the music, you're in that place. It brings you there. And I think that's part of the magic of our film.
That was part of my interview with Justin Kingsley. He's the co-writer and co-director of Chakapesh, a film about the Montreal Symphony Orchestra's tour of Quebec's Great North last year. It opens tonight in Montreal, and I really want to see it.
How far north did they go?
They went north.
Because Quebec actually goes up into the Arctic. I mean,
He was speaking there about Inuit. So I mean, if they went to the Inuit communities, that's the very top, the Kuujjuaq, and that's the very top of Quebec. But the Innu are more the north central part of Quebec and more east towards Labrador as well. Mm-hmm. So
the logistics are pretty. I mean, he had to make 2 trips up there because one the planes just aren't big enough to hold a whole symphony orchestra to go to some places. So there were two tours, one smaller, one larger with the whole gang. And I mean, I just think it's fascinating to think about the combo of throat singing with the quote unquote sophistication of our Western symphonies, our Western music. I mean, and the combination and how the two came together and created this. And I'm sure it's going to be it is a fabulous film.
I'd be very interested to see this because we have played that music on our show on the link. There's this fantastic Inuit throat singer Tanya Tagak who does collaborations with various people, very famous Western artists, and I kind of have a sense how you could put throat singing and modern music together, but it's not just Inuit music.
No.
It's also Innu, which is different, and Cree as well.
Cree as well.
All three.
Yeah. Because the Cree are more the upper central part, although they stretch around quite a bit, and the Innu and the Inuit are farther north still, generally speaking. But again, I mean, when you talk about the size of Quebec, people have to understand, like, I think you can fit something like 2 or 3 Frances in Quebec. That's how big this place is. And that's when you say, they have to fly 2 planes up there, is because they have to take because of the short landing strips, they can only fly up in Twin Otters in many cases, which, maybe 15 people or something, so they can't carry a lot of stuff. Anyway, a lot of logistical issues to take care of. Yeah, want to watch the trailer, go to the website, check out Terry's story.
It's cool.
Yeah. And that's all the time we have for the show for today. So, for my friends Terry and Levon.
He talked to me again, Leroy.
Yes,
I can't believe it.
Keep it
Jeez,
up.
I mean,
See me after class.
To be on the same show as you, Montgomery, my God.
And of course, our friends in the control room, Pierre-Luc Blais, Benoit Durand, and Capitaine Pierre Dutil.
Hey.
Till next time, take care. I'm going to have to talk to you after class.
I actually saluted you.
You did? Well, of course. He's into that kind.